Hey guys, welcome to this month's lesson in tune playing. The topic for today is constructing tune sets. A couple of you have mentioned to me that this is something that interests you or that you wanted to try to improve at. So it's gonna touch on music theory, so sort of consider it to be a little bit of tune playing, a little bit of music theory as well. And this is actually a class that I've taught before at Mad Week and also at the at Tina X flute classes. So some of you have actually heard a lot of this material already, but I hope that you will sort of find new meaning this time around, hopefully, or maybe catch something that you didn't catch before. It's also possible that I will say something that I didn't say before, so that's always a possibility. Pardon me while I just make sure this is adjusted. Okay, there we go. All right, so constructing tune sets. Now, the first thing I want to say is that this is by no means the correct way to do this or the best way. This is just my way that I've sort of adopted for what I like. And traditionally speaking, in Ireland, little or none of what I'm about to say would have been considered important, or, it might not have necessarily even been something that people thought about. So a lot of this music theory stuff, I studied classical music, I studied jazz, so sometimes I like to look at Irish music through that lens, right? I try not to really adulterate it, but I will sort of evaluate what's going on and then try to decide what I like in an Irish, piece or a set, and I'll describe that in terms of, Western theory or what have you. But that's not something that is like better than any other way of describing Irish music. It's just something that I find to be very convenient. So, traditionally in Ireland, people just put together sets however they felt like it. It could have been 3 or 4 tunes in G. It could have been playing the same tune in G and then in A, or it could have been, playing all of the tunes by one particular composer, or it could have been just playing whatever came to your mind, or, playing whatever your grandma taught you to play. So I don't think that there was such a high priority placed on the sort of harmonic implications of tune sets until the age of widespread recordings and CDs, because if you're playing live at a session, it's just in the moment, and it's more about what feels right then, and nobody's recording it. So if you went from A to G and it kind of had an interesting sound that maybe you wouldn't want on a CD, it doesn't matter in a live setting. Everybody's just having a blast, and once you get into that tune, nobody, that transition moment that maybe didn't sound so great is pretty much lost to time. But in the age of recording, then all of a sudden you really want your entire set to kind of have this interest and this contour, and you want it to be something that you can listen to over and over again and enjoy those transitional moments. So what I'm talking about today is more like those, the kind of sets that you might consider like a performance set, or like a recording set. So if you're just playing at a session and you're just having fun, do whatever you want. Don't consider the stuff I'm saying today to be any kind of rules. But if you're interested in crafting some sets that really sound like those killer sets, from your albums, from your CDs that you really enjoy, you hear that set and you're like, dang, man, when they hit that one tune, it just clicks. There's just this amazing feeling. If you're interested in that, then that's what we're going to talk about today. So, concept number 1 is going to be lift versus settling. Because as you go through we're going to talk about a 3-tune set today. So as you go through your 3 tunes, you want to have a variety of, sometimes the transition could feel like a lift, and other times it might feel like more of a settling or a homing. So if you have all lifts, it can be a little one-dimensional, and of course if you have all settles, it'll be a little bit of a downer. So the first thing to consider in this category of lift or settle is, how does the key center move? And this is about as easy as it sounds. If the key center goes up, then you're going to have a sense of lift, and if it goes down, you're going to have a sense of settling. Now, this is easiest to figure out with two keys that are a step apart. So, for example, let's try from G to A. Right? So, I don't know if you could tell that, but I was just playing a little bit of the Kesh jig. I started in G. And then I started to play the tune again in the key of A. That was a sort of an awkward transition, I thought, just melodically speaking. But harmonically, maybe you can feel that lift from G to A is definitely boom, has that kind of jubilant feel as you move up. Now, you have to be careful with this, though, because there is the second point on my list is actually going to trump the first point. And, well, not trump, but it's going to play very strongly against it. And the second consideration is going to be key signature. So, for example, G to A, the example we just did, not only was it moving up in pitch from G to A, G, A, but also when you move from G to A, you're actually adding two sharps. So G major has only one sharp, A major has three sharps. So to the ear, it sounds like a brightening. All right, I'll do it again. Ready? Here's G. And then here's A. So a general concept to keep in mind is if you're looking at the circle of fifths, anytime you're adding sharps, it's going to sound brighter. And anytime you're taking away sharps or adding flats, which is the same thing, then you are going to be sounding darker. So let's take an example where the 2 points we've considered thus far are going to play against each other. And that would be the example of moving from A major to C major. Now, A to C is an upwards shift of key center. And you would want to take the quickest path. So what I mean by that is A to C, you wouldn't go A down to C. That would be down a major sixth. You would take the shorter route. So from A to C, that would be considered an upwards motion. But the problem is A major has 3 sharps, whereas C major has 0 sharps. So that's actually a -3 shift. Let's hear what that sounds like. I can't even think of what. I don't know. Okay, so that was, I'm just using Kesh jig as like a guinea pig, or as a guinea jig. Oh boy. So anyway, I'll play that one more time. So here's A, boom, 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 and there's C. Now, once you get into C and you sort of forget about A, C is fine. I mean, it's not like there's anything wrong with the key of C. It's kind of like one of those things where, say you're living in this amazing town, and you're really loving it and it's like really cool, and then you move to a different town and it's slightly less exciting in comparison, but you kind of get used to it after a while. You make your friends, you kind of find your routine, and then after a while, you don't even really necessarily think about that old town anymore. This is all totally fictional. I mean, maybe your own lives are very, very different from that story. But I think that's what happens when you go from A to C. But, in the interest of what we're doing, that's really a pretty harsh letdown. In fact, I would even say that goes past the realm of settling. I would say that is in the realm of just like a straight up letdown. Because, yeah, it just is. Whereas there are other, like maybe a shift of 1 sharp, as opposed to 3, I think is totally appropriate. So, for example, what's a good example? Like, what if we went from D major to A minor? Now, D major has 2 sharps. A minor, in Irish music, we're really looking at A Dorian. Pardon me, most of the time, which means A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, and A. So typically most Irish tunes, if they're in a quote minor key, they're really going to have that raised 6th. So we're going to consider A minor in an Irish setting to be basically 1 sharp, as opposed to the classical version, which would have 0 sharps. So if we go from D major, 2 sharps, to A minor with 1 sharp, technically on our key signature consideration, that would be a letdown because it's losing 1 sharp. But it is an upward motion of the actual key center. And, well, I guess technically the shortest route from D to A would be down to A. But because in Irish music, for instance, on the uilleann pipes and on dadgad guitar and flute and so many instruments, D is the lowest note, then in that sense, going from D to A, you would need to go up. So, for example, the lowest note on the pipestone is this one. So going to A minor, you're going to need to go up. You don't have the low A. The only instrument that I can think of that has the lower A than the D would be like a fiddle. So for fiddle players, sometimes A can actually feel like settling down if you're going down to that low A. But anyway, so D major to A minor is going to have kind of an interesting mixture because even though boom, bum, boom, bum, you're actually moving the key center up, but you are losing 1 sharp. And you're also going from major to minor, so that's kind of a cool change. So I'll do an example. I'll do Bucks of Oranmore, which is in D. I'll just play the last part of that going into Farewell to Erin in A minor, so you can hear what that sounds like. And then I'll try to play some chords in my left hand to sort of, give you the sense of what the accompaniment would sound like, because that's a big part of this. So here we go, from D major to A minor. Right? So that has a really cool sound, and I think a very distinctively Irish sound. It's just got that modal shift. It's got that sort of epic minorness to it. So it's kind of juxtaposing that warm major, that D major, which, you got to have that to have that Irish feel, that warm major, and then the sort of epic, misty minor sound. And I think that's really nice because there's a common tone between the D major triad and the A minor, and that note is A. So if you listen to the way Bucks of Oranmore ends, it actually ends on an A, or rather the A is the note that starts the tune again. So, right, A. And that's the 5th of the D chord, but it's also can be the root of an A minor chord. So that's why that transition works really well. A lot of times going from D to A is going to work really nicely because you might have that common tone as well. And that's not only true for the melody, but I'm also talking about the chords. When you move and you have one common tone in the chords, it just has this connectivity and this continuity that you don't get without the common tone. So for example, if I move from D major to E minor, that's moving up a step, and that does not have a common tone because that's literally just taking everything and going whoop, just moving it up. So, and certainly a cool sound. I mean, nothing wrong with that. But there's something really, really nice about moving between 2 keys that share a common tone. So that leads me to my next consideration, which is moving by fourths or fifths. So we were talking about, does the key center move up or down? And the question becomes a little bit more complicated, as we noticed, when you're moving by a fourth or a fifth, because, well, a fourth going up is also a fifth going down. So it's hard to say. For example, if I say, oh, we're going from D to G, well, you might say, oh, that's definitely up. But what if I go duh, duh, and what if I, in my accompaniment, I actually go down to G? So moving by fourths or fifths it's a little bit harder to classify, whether that would be a lift or a settle. But I'm going to help you out here, because if we look at the key signature changes involved there, it's actually going to become clear that moving up a fourth, which is the same as moving down a fifth, is going to be a sort of a little bit of a letdown, whereas moving up a fifth or down a fourth is going to feel like a lift. So, for example, if we're in the key of D, that has 2 sharps, and if we're going to move up a fourth, that's going to take us to G. And G only has 1 sharp. So what you're doing is you're taking out that C sharp and you're turning it back into a C natural when you go from D major to G major. So it's not that it sounds bad. I do not want you to think I'm saying that going from D to G sounds bad, but it is certainly not the lift that you are going to need, or that you're going to want for the sort of crowning piece of your set. This might be something that you might put in the middle of your set, going from D to G, for example. So, let's say, what's a good example? Let's say I'm going along in D. And then I just got into G right there. Now that was perfectly pleasant. It was perfectly pleasant. I think it has a, to me, and I'll play that one more time. To me, it has the sense of, oh, okay, we're going here now. Well, isn't that nice? Isn't that just lovely? But it doesn't have that sense of, hell yeah, like we got to this key. Yes. No, it has that sense of like, oh yes, quite, quite a delightful little key there you have. Right. So I imagine some like British guy drinking tea saying that. So let's hear that one more time, and I want you to see if you kind of feel the same way that I do. So, let's see. Again, it's lovely. I think it's kind of, kind of delicate, kind of dainty. It sort of feels like, to me, it feels like we're going on a journey, and this is one of the stops, and we're going to enjoy it for what it is. But it's not necessarily our destination. It's not our home. And this leads me to kind of a sort of a quasi-mystical idea that I'm going to lay on you real quick. My theory about Irish music is that ultimately the home of Irish music is D major. Now, a lot of you people are probably going to get very upset that I said that, because I know some of you are devotees of G major or A major or minor keys or other more exotic things. But I think that in the scope of Irish music, D major is really going to be the home. Because if you look at the circle of fifths, D major sits right between G and A, which are the other 2 keys that might be kind of in the running. So it's right in the middle of those 2. So G is slightly darker and A is slightly brighter. So D is kind of like the nice average. It's also conveniently that lowest note of some of the seminal instruments, like the uilleann pipes, both the low drone and the actual low melody note, as well as the tin whistle, the flute, and if you play your guitar and dadgad, which a lot of Irish players do, that low bass note is the D. So you'll even hear pipers playing tunes, in other keys, you'll hear them playing tunes in A minor or E minor or G over the D drone, because the D is kind of seen as the ultimate sort of undergirding of this whole entire experiment we call Irish traditional tunes. And I do sort of ascribe to that. Maybe it's because I'm sort of a pipe aficionado, but so whenever I hear moving from D to G, to me that feels like a temporary trip away from home, a temporary suspension. You know, we're going to school, or we're going to church, or we're going to grandma's house. So it kind of has this feeling to me. Here's D, and then here's G. Right? Now I'm playing the G over D, so I'm kind of cheating because I'm giving it a stronger D flavor than really. But even if I go to the actual G in the bass, I still want to go back there. I'm sorry. That's just the way I feel. You can feel differently if you want. So anyway, to me, going up a fourth feels like a step in a journey, but not really a lift and not really home either. It just kind of feels like a step in the journey. So for me, that's a great move from tune 1 to tune 2. Going from D to G, for example, is a great move. Now let's talk about the opposite. Instead of moving up a fourth, let's talk about moving up a fifth, which is the same as moving down a fourth, right? So fourths and fifths are the inversion of one another. So now let's talk about moving up a fifth. So for example, from D to A. Now that is going to have a very bright sound because we're adding a sharp and we're going up. We talked about this before with D to A minor. This is going to have the same sound except even brighter because we're going to a major key instead of a minor key. So, let's see. What would be an example of that? Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, I can't think of... what are some... what? There's a tune in A. Let's try... how about, like, if I was going to go from the end of Lark in the Morning into that next tune? How about, Sorry, I'm sort of missing some of the keys there, but you can hear that lift, and it's just so bright. A major is definitely the brightest key in that sort of normal gamut of Irish keys. So barring weird things like E major, B major, all that jazz. A major is the brightest one you're going to get. So moving up a fifth is definitely going to have a bright sound for sure. And even if the chord motion goes down, it's still going to sound bright. So check it out. Right? In that inversion, it sounds maybe less like a straight up lift and more like a home to me. So I think there's really 3 or maybe 4 different phenomena. One of them is like just lift. Like key center's going up, key signature's going up, everything is just like getting crazy good. Another one would be home, which might be a situation where the key center is actually moving down, like the way it's being played in the accompaniment, da da, but the key signature, so the sort of tonality is gaining sharps. So that has kind of a sense of coming in for a landing in a very fulfilling way. So. Right? So D to A would be an example of that. G to D would also be an example of that. Then I think next down the list would be moving up a fourth, for example. And I think that feels like kind of a settling. A little tiny bit of a letdown, like that step in the journey that I was talking about. So that's this one, where we're here, and then we go here, right? That feels like it has another thing coming after it, right? Step in the journey. And then there was that last category of what I just consider to be a total letdown, where I just don't, for me, it doesn't do anything for me emotionally. An example of that would be like if I went, like we did earlier, A major to C major, right? I mean, it sounds epic, right? But again, that would have a great effect really only as the middle tune of a set. You do not want to do that at the end of your set. Unless you are Lunasa or Solas, in which case you can do whatever you want. But but in general, those kind of like severe, like losing 3 sharps is going to have a pretty downer effect. So basically what I'm trying to show you is that as you mix and match these different considerations, you're going to get different gradations of anything from the strongest possible lift to the most, depressing letdown ever, with all kinds of very unique flavors in between. Sometimes it feels like a step in the journey. Sometimes it feels like you're returning home. Sometimes it feels like, some things are getting better, but other things are complicated, when you go into a minor key or maybe a mixed mode. So there's all sorts of really interesting relationships that you can find between these keys. And I really think that this is relevant. I think that a lot of these things are affecting our ears and our emotions, even if we don't know, how to describe whatever it is. So the temptation would be to just say, oh, it's traditional music, music theory, all that stuff doesn't apply. Well, but we live in an age of tonal harmony, of classical harmony, and it's ingrained in our ears whether we like it or not. So I think these effects are very, very real. And also, some of the effects I'm talking about really don't depend on classical music at all. They're just based on fundamental ideas of up feels good, right? Up feels like a lift. And that is true, regardless of Beethoven or Bach. So what you want to do with all this information is start to categorize the different keys that are common to Irish music in your head based on how bright they are relative to each other, and how various keys that you might not think, or modes that you might not think of being related, actually have the same key signature. So for example, let's say we are putting together a set and we want to have the first 2 tunes in roughly the same key signature. So we don't want to jar anybody too much until the 3rd tune. That's where we're going to pull out the big guns. So for example, let's say you're going to start in G major. What is the collection of keys or modes that match the key signature of G major? Well, we have 1 sharp in the key signature. What's a minor key that has 1 sharp? E minor. That's if you're going with E natural minor, like the classical, key signature. So E minor is going to match G major in that sense. So that could be a nice change. Or whatever. I'm just making tunes up at this point. But there are actually a couple of other options as well. What if we were going for a Dorian minor sound? Well, we wouldn't go for E Dorian because that would be a different key signature. What we want to find is the Dorian minor that has the same key signature as G. And the answer to that is A. If you want the quick shortcut to figuring that out, Dorian is the 2nd mode of major. So, for instance, if you were on C major, then to find the Dorian mode with the same exact key signature, you would just go up to the 2nd note of C major, which is D. And you would then use the exact same notes from C major, but just starting on D instead of C. So, for example, D Dorian is D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. The difference between D Dorian and D natural minor is that D Dorian has a B natural, whereas D natural minor has a B flat. So it has that raised 6th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? So back to our example, we were in G major. So we will go up to A Dorian. That would be our matching Dorian, would be A. And in Irish music, most tunes that are in minor are actually in a kind of a Dorian mode, or at least a mode that references Dorian. So you might think that G major is going to pair automatically with E minor. And it does sound pretty decent, but actually G major is going to pair better with A minor in Irish music because A minor is actually in Irish music more often A Dorian. So, you know, what's a good example of that? Okay, you hear this tune? Hear that raised note? That's the F sharp. So if I was going to, you know, try to pair A Dorian with G major, that would work really, really well. And when I say, quote, really, really well, I mean that would be an example of something that you can rely on. You know, it's not crazy. It's not going to have like a really strong effect. It's kind of like if you're staying in the same key signature, then it's going to have a pleasant sound in general. So what you want to do is sort of develop a library of those little common pairings. G with A minor, D with E minor would be the same exact idea, right? Even A major with B minor can work. The difference is B minor in Irish music, not all the instruments have the G sharp, which would be that raised sixth. Not all the instruments have that G sharp, so a lot of B minor tunes tend to have the G natural, and that gives you B natural minor. So that sounds like this. Like for example. That's a B minor slip jig. So that has that da da diddly da da, that lowered sixth da da. So for instance, B natural minor would not pair as well with A, right? Because B Dorian would be the one that would pair with A major, right? Those being the adjacent keys. B natural minor, you would want to look more at D major because B natural minor has 2 sharps, not 3, so the equivalent major key would be D major. And that is actually clear in if you look at a lot of tunes that are in B minor, oftentimes the B section might be in D major. So for instance, take a look at that tune, which starts off in a nice healthy B minor. That B section is in D. So just making yourself more aware of all the sort of interconnected relationships between these keys and modes. Oh, and then finishing our discussion of what's related to G major. Sorry, I got sort of sidetracked there. We had G major, we had E natural minor, we had A Dorian. The last one to fill in the Irish spectrum would be D Mixolydian. So D Mixolydian is like D major, except it has a lowered seventh. So instead of C sharp, it's going to have C natural. So it sounds like this. Right? And so that only has 1 sharp, which is F sharp. It's the same exact key signature as G. So D Mixolydian kind of lives in that same family. So let's try to actually use some of the information that we just talked about. And I'll bring up 2 keys, and we'll talk about what we think it's going to sound like, and then we'll actually hear it on the piano. So remember, what we're thinking about is, first of all, key signature. Are we adding or are we losing sharps? Second of all, the key center itself. Are we moving up or down? Are we moving by a fifth or a fourth? And, you know, what is... Are we using a particular mode that's going to put us into a different key signature than we might expect, or something like that? And also another thing that I mentioned was, is there a common tone between the 2 keys that we're looking at? So those are all things to keep in mind. So let's try, for example, G major to C major. All right. So G major to C major sounds like really standard, doesn't it? That sounds really basic. And it is. So G to C, what interval is that? That's a fourth. Okay, it could also be a fifth going down, but we're going to go with the, the path of least resistance, which is going up a fourth. So nominally, it's going to be the key center has a lift to it, G to C. Let's talk about the key signature, though. G major has 1 sharp, C major has 0 sharps. That's going to be a, -1. Okay, so right now I think it's probably about averaging out. We got sort of a +1 and a -1 on the docket. But we also should notice that one of the special categories that we talked about was moving by a fourth. And there were a couple of reasons why moving up by a fourth is going to very much sound like an intermediate step in the journey of this set. It's hard to explain exactly why. Oh, I'll tell you one thing. Well, let's hear it, and then I'll try to explain it. So let's see if G to C sounds the way that we would expect. So I'll play the end of a tune in G, and then I'll go into one in C. So I think that hopefully we can all agree that it sounds pleasant. There's a common tone between those two keys, which is the note G, between the triads of those two keys. It sounds pleasant. We're moving from major to major, so the sort of modal, shift is constant or steady. There's no modal shift. But it doesn't sound like a lift, and to me it sounds like somewhere that we're going and it's pleasant, but we need to go somewhere else after that. So I'll play that one more time. So to me, that's very pleasant. It feels like there's a common tone between those two keys, which is the note G. So there's a sense of continuity. The modal shift is steady, meaning that we're not changing modes. It's from major to major. So it's just very normal. But it doesn't feel like a lift, I think, because, in my opinion, the reason, among other things, one of them is the fact that the key signature dropped a sharp, but also the key of G in that core triad GBD, you have that B, right? And then you would think that going from that B note to the note C would sound like a nice resolution, and it does, but I think that once you've heard the G chord, then when you hear the C, it feels like the C is simply a 4 suspended over the G that wants to go back to that third, which is B. So it kind of, I did this earlier in the video, it kind of sounds like this to me. You've got the B, and then the C feels like, no, but I kind of have the memory of the G in my head, which is why I'm playing in the bass. And so the C still just feels like it's yearning to go back to B. Even if I play the C in the bass, it feels like it wants to go Amen, which is the plagal cadence, right? So I think that plagal cadence is sort of the ultimate homing device or move of Irish music, and really probably all music. Well, Western music. And here's where it gets confusing. The plagal cadence, although it goes from 4 to 1, that's not a movement of a fourth going up. So this is where it gets confusing. A plagal cadence is actually a fourth going down, because from 4 to 1. So the plagal cadence is the equivalent of a fifth going up. So remember from earlier, we said fifth going up is bright. Fourth going up is not as bright. So even though plagal cadence goes from 4 to 1, don't be fooled by the word 4 in there. It's actually harmonically equivalent to moving up by a fifth. And then the authentic cadence, which is going from 5 to 1, Similarly confusing is the equivalent of going up a fourth. So that's going to be not quite as bright. My goodness, that's confusing. If you want to chat with me about that, just give me a call and we'll talk about that. So anyway, we talked about one. Let's do another example. What about, let's do something a little spicier. How about this one? B minor to C major. Now, that's probably one you haven't thought of very often. Right off the bat, it sounds like it could be very promising, right? Going from B to C, that's the key center's moving up. That should be a good sign. But let's look at the key signature. So B minor, even if it's natural minor, it's 2 sharps. If it's Dorian minor, it's 3 sharps. But we'll go with 2 just to be conservative. And then C major is 0. So that's going to be a letdown of 2 sharps worth. So I'm thinking this one's going to sound pretty dark. And the other thing I'll tell you is that moving up by a half step is a little bit more ominous than moving up by a whole step. So, for instance, half step is the Jaws thing, right? Whereas whole step is a lot brighter. So moving from B to C is going to be quite different than moving from G to A, for example, because B to C is a half step. So let's see what happens when we go from B minor to C. My prediction is that it's going to sound very bizarre. Let's see. What about... what's a nice B minor tune? How about that one? Here we go. Now that is just very bizarre. In fact, let's hear that a little bit slower. So there's the B minor. There's the C. It feels like the bridge of a song from like Les Mis or like some other musical. You know what I'm saying? It just it's one of those changes that really sounds like somebody was trying really, really hard. And I love Les Mis, don't get me wrong. I was in the show. It's amazing. But yeah, some of those changes, feel very Broadway. So that's definitely not one that's not going to be one of your go-tos for Irish music. It's going to feel like a lot darker going from B minor to C because we're losing 2 sharps and also that half step is a little bit sinister. Right? Let's do one more and then we'll move on. How about let's do something kind of interesting. Let's do this one. E minor. I'm gonna make it a little harder for you. E minor to A mixolydian. Okay. E minor to A mixolydian. Now, a lot of you are probably scratching your heads thinking, I don't even know what the heck A mixolydian is or how to figure this out. Basically, it's just A major, but without the G sharp. Instead, it has a G natural. So it's A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G, A. Pardon me. So that's A mixolydian, has 2 sharps. E minor. Let's talk about Dorian minor because that's what we're going to find in Irish music a lot. No. Let's make it more exciting. Let's do natural minor. So E natural minor is going to have 1 sharp. So let's talk about what we think is going to happen. So E to A. Nominally, that's up a fourth. So that is a raising. So our first consideration is just looking at the key center and where it moves. So that's sort of a plus. Key signature wise, E natural minor has 1 sharp, which is F sharp. A mixolydian has 2 sharps. It has the F sharp, but it also has the C sharp. So that's a plus. Okay, so we've got 2 pluses going thus far. Now we have to look at, is it one of these 4th or 5th things? It is moving up by a 4th, but here's where it gets a little interesting. The stuff we talked about with 4ths and 5ths really applies primarily with major chords because that thing I talked about with the B and the C kind of pulling against each other and the C feeling like a suspended fourth over the G, well, that's not going to happen in a minor key because, for example, in E minor, our fundamental triad is E, G, and B. And the note A, which is the note we're going towards, is a whole step above the G, not a half step. So there is not that fundamental tension between the third and the fourth of a minor key, whereas there is in a major key. Okay? That's kind of important, actually. That's a good thing to be aware of in music in general. In a minor key, there's no fundamental tension between the third and the fourth. Listen. E, G, that's the third. A, that's the fourth. They're all, because that's a whole step, not a half step. It's all part of that Zen pentatonic collection that we talked about in another video. Whereas, if it was major, then the A clashes with that G sharp, and so moving to A from E major is a much more controversial technique than moving to A from E minor, right? So going from E minor to A, even though it fits that moving up a fourth definition we talked about earlier when we did G to C and D to G, this is actually going to sound totally cool and totally awesome because it doesn't have that tension from that major key situation. So all points are going in its favor. I think it's going to sound very bright. I think it's going to sound like a lift. Let's see here. What I had a tune in mind for this. It was Hair's Paw. Here's the B section. All right, did you hear that shift from E natural minor to A mixolydian? That's a set that's part of a set that I put together that has a really nice sound to it. That's those two tunes are the Hair's Paw, and then the last one is a reel whose name I wasn't actually recorded on the album, but it's a Mary Bergen reel, so I kind of just call it Mary Bergen's. But anyway, listen to that one more time. So this is this is E minor, sorry. Now that has a super cool sound to me, and especially that's a good one to play up tempo. I'll link you guys to a video of me playing that set so you can hear what I'm talking about. So anyway, E minor to A major or A mixolydian, that's a great change. That's going to sound like a lift. And what you want to do is think about what are some ways to transpose that exact sound. So E minor to A mixolydian is the same exact sound as A minor to D mixolydian, right? Same interval, up a fourth, and same qualities. Could also be the same as, for example, D minor to G mixolydian. So I like to do a set, for example, that goes from Tuttles in D minor to The Girl That Broke My Heart in G mixolydian. So that's right? And I never played these tunes on piano. That's why I'm kind of playing them a little bit poorly. But yeah, so that moving up by a fourth, changing from minor to major, that's a great move right there.